My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm 26 years old. If you saw me standing in that auction hall, you'd probably think I didn't belong there. And maybe that's exactly what my mother wanted everyone to believe when she turned to me, smirked, and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Stop acting rich." The words cut through the hall like a knife. A few people chuckled, others leaned over to whisper, hiding their grins behind their hands. I felt the heat rush to my face, not just from embarrassment, but from the cruel familiarity of it. This wasn't the first time my family tried to put me in my place. For as long as I can remember, I've been treated like the outsider, the one who wasn't good enough, smart enough, or rich enough. If I spoke up, I was told I was arrogant. If I stayed quiet, I was called weak. But that day was different. The hall wasn't just filled with relatives. It was packed with neighbors, old family friends, and strangers with deep pockets, all watching me like I was the punchline of a bad joke. My mom's laughter carried across the room, and my sister Melissa shook her head in pity, like I was some hopeless fool. They thought I would bow my head. They thought I'd give up before even raising my hand, but instead, I placed my bid. The room went silent. The auctioneer lifted his gavel, the tension thick enough to choke on. And when the wood slammed down with a sharp crack, his voice boomed, "Sold!" My mother's smile vanished. The crowd's laughter froze. And that moment, that was only the beginning. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in a house where I was always reminded of what I was not. My parents, Mark and Evelyn, gave the world the impression of a perfect family. My father was a respected contractor, my mother an active volunteer, and from the outside, our home looked like the kind of place people admired. But inside those walls, there was an unspoken rule. Everything revolved around Melissa, my younger sister. She was the golden child, the one they paraded at church and neighborhood gatherings, the one they praised for the smallest effort. I was there too, of course, but mostly as the shadow in the corner. If Melissa sang one note on the piano, she was called talented. If I brought home a good grade, I was told not to brag. I remember the first time it really stung. It was my 12th birthday. I came downstairs expecting maybe a small cake, maybe even just a happy birthday from my parents. Instead, the living room was covered in pink balloons. A banner hung across the wall congratulating Melissa on winning a piano contest. On the kitchen table was a cake, 3 layers high, with her name written in blue frosting. I stood quietly until I couldn't anymore and whispered, "It's my birthday." My mother didn't even look at me. She tightened Melissa's bow and said, "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. We can't celebrate everything." Melissa actually achieved something. I swallowed hard and smiled like it didn't matter, but it burned inside me. Years later, on the day of my high school graduation, I searched the crowd as I crossed the stage. I wanted to see them smiling, waving, proud. But the row where they were supposed to sit was empty. I learned afterward that they had left early. Melissa had a recital. I walked home in my gown, the diploma case in my hands feeling like an empty box. When I opened the front door, there they were, clapping for her as she played the same piece she had performed a dozen times. No one even asked me how my ceremony went. The worst came when I got the letter I thought would finally change everything. I had been awarded a full scholarship to the University of Texas. I ran into the kitchen with the envelope, my hands shaking with excitement. "Dad, Mom, look, a full scholarship. They're paying everything." My father barely glanced at it, took a sip of his coffee, and muttered, "Scholarships are for kids whose parents can't provide. Don't brag about being poor." Before I could respond, Melissa walked in holding a flyer for a summer music camp. My mother's face lit up. "Sweetheart, this is wonderful. We'll pay for the camp. Don't worry." The scholarship letter trembled in my hand, unnoticed. I realized then that no achievement of mine would ever matter. The only person who truly saw me was my grandmother. She lived 2 towns away and never said much against my parents, but her eyes told me she knew. One evening, sitting on her porch, she held my hand and said softly, "Patience is strength, Daniel. Life has a way of showing the truth when the time is right. Your moment will come." Her words stayed with me, a quiet ember I carried inside. I worked part-time jobs all through college, saving what I could, building quietly. While my parents poured money into Melissa's competitions and clothes, I invested in myself. I never told them how much I was earning, how much I was saving. Every late-night shift, every dollar tucked away was my silent rebellion. But no matter how much I pushed forward, the humiliation at home never stopped. If I dressed well, my mom said I was pretending to be rich. If I came home tired from work, my dad called me lazy. Melissa laughed at me openly, certain she was destined for greatness, while I was destined for nothing. Deep down, I knew the day would come when all of that scorn would spill over in public, when they would finally try to humiliate me in front of everyone, not just within the walls of our house. I just didn't know where or when. And then the invitation came. An estate auction was announced, one that my grandmother had quietly prepared before she passed. My parents laughed at the idea of me attending. "You don't belong at places like that," my mother sneered. Melissa smirked, adding, "Don't embarrass yourself, Daniel." Auctions are for people who can actually afford things. I said nothing, but inside I knew this was it. The moment my grandmother had promised me was finally arriving. I could feel it, like a storm building in the distance. They thought the auction would be another stage for them to mock me, another chance to remind me of my place. What they didn't realize was that this time, the stage wasn't theirs. The gavel would come down, and everything they thought they controlled would begin to slip away. The auction hall smelled of polished wood and old money. Men in tailored suits and women in pearls filled the rows, their eyes sharp, their bidding cards resting on their laps like weapons waiting to be raised. I sat in the back, quietly, dressed neatly, but not extravagantly. My mother spotted me from across the room and rolled her eyes, whispering something to Melissa that made her laugh. I knew exactly what they were saying. Daniel doesn't belong here. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin today's bidding, we have one item of special note. This property has been tied to the Carter estate for generations, and as per the late Mrs. Margaret Carter's instructions, certain heirs have been given priority consideration." My heart stopped. Margaret Carter, my grandmother. The room stirred, whispers running like a current. My parents shifted uncomfortably, and my father straightened in his seat, pretending confidence. He assumed the privilege was his, maybe Melissa's, certainly not mine. The auctioneer cleared his throat and read from a document. As outlined in the will, Daniel Carter, grandson of the late Mrs. Carter, is hereby recognized as a qualified primary bidder for the family estate lot. The room froze. My name echoed off the wooden beams, and I felt every pair of eyes swing toward me. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's mouth dropped open. Melissa laughed nervously, then realized no one else was laughing. My mother shot up from her seat. "There must be a mistake," she barked. "Daniel, he doesn't have the means. He's pretending. He's always pretending." The auctioneer raised a hand calmly. "The documentation is in order. His name is listed clearly. Daniel Carter has equal right to bid." I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, humiliated. It all swirled inside me like a storm. I didn't flinch. I raised my bidding card slowly, steady as a rock. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My father muttered something under his breath, gripping the arm of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. Melissa leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You're embarrassing us, Daniel. You don't belong here. Sit down before people laugh harder." But no one was laughing now. They were watching, waiting. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium lightly. "Very well. Shall we begin the bidding at 100,000? Numbers began flying through the air. 150, 200, 250. Every time a number was called, I matched it, my card rising without hesitation. My parents stared at me in disbelief, their mocking grins fading with each raise. Finally, my mother couldn't take it anymore. She stood up again, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He's bluffing. He doesn't have that kind of money. This is a joke." The auctioneer didn't flinch. "Ma'am, the legitimacy of bids is not for debate. Unless he defaults, his offers stand." The truth was simple. My grandmother had left me more than words of comfort. Quietly, in trust funds and careful arrangements, she had ensured I would never stand powerless. I hadn't told anyone. I wanted this moment, the moment when their certainty of my failure crumbled. The bidding war climbed higher. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm. I could hear whispers in the crowd. Who knew Daniel had backing? Maybe the rumors were true. At 350,000, silence finally fell. No one else raised a card. The auctioneer looked around the room, his eyes landing on me. 350,000. Going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down. "Sold to Daniel Carter." The crack echoed through the hall like thunder. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then the room erupted into murmurs, shock, disbelief. I looked straight ahead, not at my mother's furious glare or Melissa's stunned expression. The hall no longer felt suffocating. It felt like air was rushing back into my lungs for the first time in years. But even in that moment of victory, I could feel it coming. My parents weren't finished. They would not accept this humiliation quietly. And deep down, I knew they were already plotting their next move. The gavel had declared me the winner of the bid. But the real battle hadn't even begun. The sound of the gavel was still echoing in my chest when the whispers began to swell around me. People turned in their seats, some surprised, some impressed, but most just curious. Who was I? The boy they had always seen in the shadow of my family, now suddenly holding the winning bid? I could feel the heat of their stares, but for the first time, I didn't feel small under them. I felt steady, anchored. That calm didn't last long. My mother shot up from her chair, her heels clicking furiously against the polished floor as she stormed toward me. Her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Everyone, listen to me. He doesn't know what he's doing. Daniel is nothing but a pretender. He's making a fool of himself and this family." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to get involved, but no one could look away. My father followed her, slower but no less stern. his hand gripping Melissa's arm as they came forward like a firing squad. Melissa smirked as she stepped into the center of the hall. "You think you've won something?" she sneered. "You don't even have a place to live half the time. People like you don't buy estates, you clean them." Laughter bubbled from a corner of the hall, relatives who had always taken my parents' side. The sound of it was sharp, humiliating. The auctioneer tried to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, the bid has been settled." This kind of disruption, but my mother cut him off, her voice rising higher. "Daniel will withdraw. Right now. He's always been irresponsible, always been weak. He's embarrassing us in front of this entire community." She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "Sign the withdrawal. End this nonsense before you destroy what little reputation we have left." Someone in the crowd muttered, "This is getting ugly." Chairs scraped as people leaned closer, eager to watch the drama unfold. I stayed silent, my card still in my hand, my heart hammering but my face calm. I could feel my grandmother's voice echoing in the back of my mind. Patience is strength. Melissa stepped closer until she was right in front of me. "Look around, Daniel. Everyone knows you don't belong here. You're a joke. If you had any dignity left, you'd walk out that door and never come back." She tilted her head, her smile cruel. "Go on. Prove us right." I looked into her eyes, and for once, I didn't lower mine. That only seemed to infuriate her more. Then, in front of everyone, she lifted her hand and slapped me across the face. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the silent hall. Gasps shot through the crowd. Someone dropped their program. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The sting burned across my cheek, but it wasn't the pain that struck me. It was the silence. Every single person in that hall had just seen what my family really was. The mask they wore in public, the facade of perfect respectability, had shattered with one strike. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did she just slap him? In public? His own sister? My father stepped forward quickly, trying to contain the damage. "He provoked her," he snapped. "Daniel always provokes us." He doesn't understand respect, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Eyes darted between my reddening cheek and Melissa's smug grin. My mother shoved a paper in front of me, the withdrawal form already scribbled with legal jargon. "Sign it," she hissed. "You don't want to test me in front of these people." The auctioneer looked uneasy, but said nothing, caught between authority and spectacle. I lowered my gaze to the paper, letting the room think I might actually give in. I could hear relatives chuckling, neighbors whispering, Melissa exhaling in satisfaction. They thought they had me cornered, like always. But deep inside, I wasn't the boy they thought I was anymore. I wasn't the 12-year-old begging for a birthday cake or the graduate walking home alone. I was the man my grandmother believed I would become, the one she had quietly prepared for this very moment. I looked back up slowly, my cheek still stinging, but my voice steady. "No," I said clearly, so the whole hall could hear. A wave of murmurs rolled across the room. My mother's face twisted, Melissa's smirk faltered, my father's hands curled into fists. And yet, in that refusal, in that single word, I felt the power shift. What none of them knew, what none of them could see, was that the humiliation they thought would destroy me had just turned into their own undoing. And it wasn't just the people in the hall who had witnessed it. From the corner of my eye, I noticed it. A faint red dot blinking on a phone camera held low by one of my cousins. My humiliation wasn't contained within these four walls anymore. It was streaming, and the whole world or at least everyone who mattered in our community, was already watching. The sting of Melissa's slap hadn't even faded when the room erupted into murmurs. My mother shoved the withdrawal paper closer to me, her voice slicing through the noise. "Sign it. Right now. You're humiliating us." I stared at the document, my chest rising and falling, but I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I could feel the eyes of the crowd drilling into me. Neighbors from our street, family friends, even people I barely knew but who knew us. They weren't just watching anymore. They were judging. My father stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Daniel, enough. Be reasonable. You're not cut out for this kind of responsibility. Do the right thing. Give it back to your family." His voice shook with anger, but he tried to mask it with authority. Melissa, still riding the rush of her outburst, leaned in so close I could smell the perfume she always wore. "Do you see how pathetic you look? Sitting here with nothing, pretending you belong. Everyone is laughing at you." The laughter wasn't loud anymore. It was quieter, nervous, uncertain. People weren't sure which side of the story they were on, but I knew what they had all just witnessed. That slap had cracked something open that my family couldn't glue back together. Still, the pressure mounted. My mother hissed, "If you don't sign, don't think you'll ever walk into this family again. You'll be cut off from everything." I almost laughed, as if I hadn't been cut off my entire life. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the rows of polished shoes and stiff dresses, a faint red light blinking from a phone camera. My cousin, always curious, had his phone tilted just enough to catch everything. Melissa's slap, my mother's threats, my father's humiliation. It wasn't just being recorded. It was streaming. The realization sent a rush of heat through me. I didn't know how many people were watching, but I knew one thing. The performance my parents had staged wasn't playing out the way they thought. The carefully built image of the perfect Carters had just been broadcast raw and unedited. I leaned back slowly, my voice calm but loud enough for the front rows to hear. "No, I won't sign." Gasps cut through the hall. My mother's face turned crimson. Melissa's eyes widened. My father's fists clenched. "You ungrateful child," my mother spat. "How dare you defy us in front of everyone?" I stood, my chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound echoing louder than her words. I faced them, my cheek still red from the slap, but my voice steady. "You humiliated me my whole life. And now you've done it in front of everyone. Congratulations. You've finally shown them who you really are." The crowd shifted, whispers racing through the hall. "He's right. Did you see the way she slapped him? I never knew they treated him like that." Melissa tried to laugh it off, her voice shrill. "Oh, please. Don't listen to him. He's just bitter. He's nothing." But the damage was done. People weren't laughing anymore. They were looking at her, at my parents, with unease. Respect was slipping away from them faster than they could grab it back, and that blinking red light kept going. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his patience running thin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this disruption must end. The sale is valid. Mr. Carter has won the bid. That is final." The words were a hammer on stone. The decision was sealed. My parents could scream, Melissa could slap, relatives could whisper, but nothing would undo the gavel's strike. I picked up the document my mother had shoved at me, held it high for everyone to see, and then tore it clean down the middle. The sound ripped through the air like thunder. Pieces fluttered to the ground around my shoes. The hall erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, some just sat there stunned. My parents froze in horror, Melissa's face twisted in rage, my father's lips tightened like a man watching his empire crumble. And somewhere, on a live stream, those torn pieces fell for everyone else to witness too. I turned to the auctioneer and nodded once, firmly. I stand by my bid. The gavel was raised again. Then it is settled. The crack echoed through the hall a second time, but this time it wasn't just the sound of a sale. It was the sound of a family's mask shattering, the sound of years of humiliation turning back on the ones who had dealt it. And as I walked back to my seat, the hall buzzing with whispers and shock, I realized something chilling. This wasn't the end of their cruelty. It was only the beginning of their downfall. The hall was still buzzing from the shredded document when the heavy wooden doors at the back creaked open. For a moment, no one paid attention. But when a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, carrying a slim leather briefcase, the whispers changed. Heads turned. Even the auctioneer straightened, his voice catching as he announced quietly, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jonathan Hayes." The name carried weight. Jonathan Hayes wasn't just a lawyer. He was a corporate attorney with a reputation for dismantling entire companies with a single clause. He was also my grandmother's trusted advisor. My parents froze. My father's face went pale. My mother's lips parted. Melissa's smirk faltered. They hadn't expected him. They hadn't even known he was coming. Mr. Hayes walked steadily down the aisle, his shoes echoing on the polished floor. He stopped at my table, resting one hand on my shoulder. "Daniel," he said calmly, his voice deep and steady, "I apologize for arriving late, but it seems I've come at exactly the right moment." My mother tried to regain her footing, stepping forward quickly. "Mr. Hayes, there's been a misunderstanding. My son, he's confused. He doesn't understand the responsibilities of a bid like this. He'll be withdrawing." Mr. Hayes turned his gaze on her, sharp enough to slice through her words. "Mrs. Carter, I've reviewed Margaret Carter's instructions personally." Daniel was not only given priority to bid, he was also granted legal financial backing through a trust established years ago. Every dollar of his bid is legitimate and binding. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. My relatives, who had been whispering insults minutes before, now exchanged nervous glances. My father stammered, But we're the parents. Surely we have the right to..." Hayes cut him off without raising his voice. "You have no such right. In fact, I have in my possession documents showing attempts to misappropriate funds from Daniel's trust over the past decade. Forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, activities that, if presented to a judge, would constitute fraud." The color drained from my father's face completely. My mother tried to speak, but no sound came out. Melissa stepped back, her earlier arrogance shrinking into nervous glances at the people staring at her family. The auctioneer cleared his throat, visibly relieved to have order restored. "Well then, that settles the matter. Mr. Carter's purchase stands." But Hayes wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, setting it on the auctioneer's podium. "There's more. My client has endured years of financial and emotional manipulation at the hands of his immediate family. Today, in front of dozens of witnesses, that manipulation became physical assault." The crowd murmured louder. Everyone remembered the slap, the way Melissa's hand cracked against my face, and Hayes knew it too. He glanced toward the back corner, where the faint red light still blinked. "I am told," he said smoothly, "that this entire scene has been streamed live, which means what was once rumor is now evidence. Public evidence. Melissa gasped, You can't use that. It was private." "It was public the moment you raised your hand against him in this hall," Hayes replied evenly. "The footage merely confirms what every witness here has already seen with their own eyes." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My mother tried to salvage what little was left of their image. She forced a brittle smile. We only wanted what was best for him. Surely people understand how family arguments can look worse than they are." But no one looked convinced. Neighbors avoided her eyes. Relatives shifted uncomfortably. The performance was over. The mask gone. Hayes adjusted his tie, then placed a firm hand on my shoulder again. "Daniel, your grandmother trusted you with this estate because she saw your strength when others refused to. Her words to me were clear. He may walk through fire, but he will not bend." He looked around the hall, his voice carrying. "And today, you've proven her right." The applause started small, from a corner row, hesitant but genuine. Then another joined in, and another. Within moments, the hall that had once mocked me was now clapping, not for Melissa, not for my parents, for me. I stood there, stunned, my cheek still burning, but my chest lighter than it had been in years. Hayes nodded slightly, as if to say, "This is only the beginning." My parents sat down slowly, trapped in the silence of their own disgrace. Melissa buried her face in her hands, whispering frantically, "This can't be happening." But it was, and every whisper, every clap, every recording being shared outside those walls was proof. The gavel had declared me the buyer. Hayes had declared me legitimate. And the world, or at least the community that had always watched from the sidelines, had finally seen the truth. For the first time, the humiliation wasn't mine to carry. It was theirs. And their downfall was only just beginning. When the gavel struck for the last time, it didn't just seal the sale. It sealed my family's fate. I could see it in their faces as the hall began to clear. Some guests avoided eye contact. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads. A few even looked at me with something I had never seen directed my way before. Respect. But when they glanced at my parents and Melissa, their expressions shifted to pity, even disgust. The humiliation that had always been mine to bear was now theirs. Outside the auction hall, the whispers grew louder. By the time I stepped onto the marble steps, the story had already begun to spread. Phones buzzed, notifications pinged. I didn't have to wonder what was happening. I knew. That faint red blinking light had done its job. It hadn't gone viral across the world. That wasn't necessary. It had spread exactly where it hurt most. To our community, neighbors, relatives, church members, old business associates, everyone who had ever admired my parents' perfect facade now had a front row seat to the truth. Within 24 hours, the clip of Melissa's slap was circulating in group chats. WhatsApp threads lit up with captions like, "Did you see what the Carters did?" On Facebook, people shared grainy screenshots with comments like, "Shocking behavior from such a respected family." The humiliation multiplied every time the video was forwarded. My parents, who had always cared more about reputation than love, were suddenly drowning in the one thing they feared most: public shame. Melissa was the first to feel the blow. Her music scholarship had always been the crown jewel of her golden child image. But donors don't like scandals, and schools don't like bad publicity. By the end of the week, an official letter arrived citing conduct unbecoming and community concerns. Her scholarship was revoked. I watched her crumble. For the first time, she wasn't the untouchable prodigy. She was just another girl with a broken dream, staring at her phone in disbelief. "They can't do this to me," she sobbed, clutching the letter. But they could. And they had. My father's downfall came next. His contracting business had thrived on reputation, handshakes, trust, word of mouth. But now, every client he'd ever worked with had seen him standing in that hall, trying to force his own son into surrender, exposed for attempted fraud by Hayes. Contracts began to fall through. First one, then another. By the end of the month, half of his deals had been canceled. Word spread faster than nails through wood. Don't trust Mark Carter. My mother, the woman who had always cared about appearances more than reality, found herself shunned in the places she valued most. At church, where she once paraded Melissa as a prodigy, people avoided her pew. Her whispers of judgment toward others had turned into whispers against her. "That's the woman who mocked her own son," they said, eyes darting toward her. She tried to smile, tried to hold her head high, but every sideways glance was a blade. And me, for the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow. The property I had won at the auction became more than just land and bricks. It was a symbol. I poured myself into it, restoring it carefully, honoring the legacy my grandmother had entrusted to me. People who had once dismissed me began to show interest. A local historical society praised the project. A real estate firm approached me about partnerships, and even business leaders, people who wouldn't have given me a second look before, began shaking my hand. Hayes guided me through the process, steady and sharp, teaching me how to navigate the paperwork, the contracts, the inevitable obstacles. "This is just the start, Daniel," he told me. "Your grandmother didn't just leave you property. She left you a foundation." The more I worked, the stronger I felt. And the stronger I felt, the smaller my family's voices became. But the collapse wasn't just about lost contracts or revoked scholarships. It was about the community they had built their lives around turning its back. The neighbors who once waved eagerly now closed their doors when my parents walked by. The relatives who once praised Melissa now whispered about how spoiled she was. Even family friends began to distance themselves, afraid the stain of scandal would rub off. One evening, as I walked through the estate grounds, I heard my phone buzz. A message from an old neighbor. "Proud of you, Daniel. Took guts to stand tall. They finally got what they deserved." I stood there for a long time, staring at that message, realizing I wasn't invisible anymore. Meanwhile, inside my parents' house, the atmosphere had changed. I wasn't there, but I heard the stories. My father snapping at my mother blaming Melissa, Melissa screaming at both of them. The unity they once flaunted had cracked into jagged shards. Every dinner was an argument. Every night was a storm. And the storm didn't stop. Melissa tried to claw her way back into the spotlight, but doors kept closing. Every audition ended with polite rejection. Every competition overlooked her. The slap video followed her like a shadow. "Isn't she the one who hit her brother?" people whispered. No stage could silence that echo. My father fought to salvage his business, but every deal ended the same way. People smiled politely, then said, "We'll be in touch." They never were. The trust was gone, and trust is a currency you can't buy back. My mother withdrew into herself, her once loud voice now barely more than a mutter. She stopped attending church, stopped hosting gatherings, stopped being the woman who judged everyone else. She couldn't bear the judgment turned on her. For years, I had been the one shrinking in their shadow. Now they were the ones shrinking, unable to bear the light of truth. And yet, as satisfying as it was to see justice unfold, it wasn't without weight. Late at night, I would sit alone in the estate's study, staring at the old family portraits my grandmother had preserved. My parents' faces looked back at me from younger years, smiling, proud, full of hope. I wondered when it had all gone wrong, when love had been replaced with favoritism, when pride had turned into cruelty. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the sting of Melissa's slap, the sound of my mother's mocking voice, the sight of my father trying to strip me of what was mine. Those weren't mistakes. They were choices. Choices that had led them here. And now the consequences were theirs to carry. For me, the path was clear. The estate grew into more than property. It became a business, a home, and a symbol of the strength my grandmother had always seen in me. The community respected me now, not because of my family name, but because of what I had built, what I had endured. I had spent my whole life waiting for their approval. I didn't need it anymore. The fall of the Carters wasn't just a spectacle. It was a lesson carved in stone. When you build your legacy on cruelty and pride, it will crumble the moment the truth comes to light. And crumble it did. The estate was quiet the evening I finally walked its halls alone. The sunlight spilled through tall windows, painting the wooden floors gold. My grandmother's portrait hung in the study, her eyes kind and steady, just as I remembered. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in someone else's house. I felt at home. Life had shifted in ways I could never have imagined. My parents no longer controlled the narrative. Their names, once spoken with admiration, now carried a stain. Melissa's laughter, once the soundtrack of my humiliation, had gone silent, replaced with bitter complaints about what she had lost. The neighbors who once looked past me now stopped to greet me. I had become visible. But peace didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came slowly, quietly, like the soft wind that rustled the trees outside. It came in the mornings when I opened my eyes and realized I didn't dread the day ahead. It came in the evenings when I stood on the porch and watched the world settle without waiting for someone to mock me. I thought about the years I had spent chasing their approval. Every achievement I held up like a torch, begging for light, only to be pushed back into shadow. I used to believe love was something I had to earn from them, that if I just tried harder, they would finally see me. But the truth was simple and cruel. They had never wanted to see me. And that truth freed me, because now I understood what my grandmother meant when she told me patience was strength. She hadn't just left me property or money. She had left me the chance to prove, not to them, but to myself, that I was more than their cruelty. I still carried the scars. Sometimes, when I heard laughter in a crowd, my chest tightened, remembering what it felt like to be mocked, dismissed, slapped in front of everyone. But scars don't mean weakness. They mean survival. They mean I walked through the fire and came out standing. Looking back, I realized something else. Blood doesn't make you family. Respect does. Love does. And I had wasted too many years searching for those things in a house where they never existed. Now I didn't search anymore. I built them. In my friendships, in the work I poured into the estate, in the quiet strength I carried within myself. The humiliation I endured was real, but so was the peace I had claimed, and peace, I learned, is non-negotiable. I stood before my grandmother's portrait and whispered softly, "You were right," or The tables turned for the first time in years. My chest didn't feel heavy. The world didn't need to see me as a victim anymore. They saw me as someone who stood his ground, someone who refused to bend even when mocked, slapped, cornered. And if there was one thing I had learned from it all, it was this: you don't have to prove yourself to people who are determined not to see your worth. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living in peace. I walked to the window, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the fields. My family's voices no longer echoed in my head. The laughter, the insults, the dismissal, they had all faded. What remained was silence. And in that silence, I finally heard the one thing I had been chasing my whole life: freedom